If you could travel back in time exactly 40,000 years, find a clearing in a primeval forest and wait, you would eventually see someone emerge from the trees. From a distance, everything about them would feel familiar. The way they walked on two legs, the way their arms swung at their sides, the way they carried a tool or glanced up at the sky. You would recognize them instantly as a person. But as they stepped closer into the light, a strange, unsettling feeling would begin to settle in. The shape of their skull would look slightly wrong. Their brow would be a heavy, unbroken ridge of bone, casting a deep shadow over their eyes. Their face would lack a chin entirely, projecting forward in a way that felt entirely alien, and their frame would be impossibly wide and muscular, built like an anvil. They would look at you, and you would look at them. You would both be looking at another human being, but you would not be looking at a member of your species. If you made this journey, you wouldn't just meet one alternative version of humanity. Depending on where you landed on the planet, you might encounter a tiny, silent-dwelling person, no taller than a modern 3-year-old child, or a towering, ghostly relative navigating the high-altitude plateaus of Asia. 40,000 years ago. The strangest thing about seeing another kind of human was that nobody considered it strange. It was normal. The unusual sight wasn't another human species. The unusual sight would have been being alone. It was simply how the world worked. Every human being alive today has grown up inside the same illusion, that humanity has always looked like this: one planet, one species, one version of being human. But for most of our history, none of those things were true. Because every single person you have ever met, every face you have ever seen on the news, and every historical figure you have ever read about belongs to the exact same biological group. We assume this is the natural state of things. We look at the Earth and see a planet with thousands of species of birds, dozens of species of cats, and endless varieties of beetles. But when it comes to humans, there is only us. We treat the word human and the biological designation Homo sapiens as if they are perfect synonyms. We grow up believing that the story of humanity is a straight line, a lonely ladder that we climbed from primitive apes until we reached the top, standing completely alone. But this loneliness is a very recent invention. For the vast majority of our history, the human family tree wasn't a lonely trunk. It was a dense, tangled bushes, crowded with different experiments in what it meant to be a person. The true mystery of our origin isn't how we evolved. The true mystery is how we ended up so completely alone. To understand how crowded the past really was, we have to look at the family we lost. For a long time, Western science looked at the most famous of these lost relatives, the Neanderthals, as a crude, evolutionary rough draft. They were depicted as slouching, dim-witted brutes who could barely manage a grunt. But the more we dig into the soil of Europe and the Middle East, the more that caricature dissolves, replacing it with something far more haunting. Neanderthals weren't inferior versions of us. They were a highly sophisticated, deeply successful human species that walked the Earth for roughly 400,000 years, far longer than modern humans have been around. They didn't just survive the brutal, crushing winters of the Ice Age, they thrived in them. They possessed brains that were, on average, slightly larger than our own. They manufactured complex adhesives from birch bark to spear points, built organized living spaces, and used natural pigments to paint abstract designs on cave walls. More than that, they felt when a Neanderthal died, their companions didn't simply abandon the body to the scavengers. They laid them down in the earth, sometimes tucking their legs toward their chest. Some sites even suggest ritual treatment of the dead. They possessed a concept of grief, a sense of community, and a recognition of value in life that we like to think belongs entirely to us. They looked at the stars and wondered, just like we do. Yet while Neanderthals were dominating the frozen landscapes of Europe, an entirely different human drama was unfolding thousands of miles to the east. Deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, scientists examining a tiny, unassuming fragment of a finger bone made a discovery that shattered the existing timeline of history. DNA extraction revealed that this bone didn't belong to a modern human, nor did it belong to a Neanderthal. It belonged to a completely distinct, previously unknown branch of the human family tree, the Denisovans. We have very few fossils of the Denisovans, a few teeth, a jawbone, a scattering of fragments. They are a ghost lineage, a species we know almost entirely through the genetic echoes they left behind. Yet, they spanned vast territories across Asia, adapting to high-altitude environments and deep forests. They were sophisticated enough to create beautiful, polished jewelry, including a striking green chlorite stone bracelet that looks like it was crafted with modern tools. So, 40,000 years ago, you have Homo sapiens in Africa and the Middle East, Neanderthals in Europe, and Denisovans in Asia. The planet is already starting to feel crowded, but the picture gets even stranger. If you traveled down to the tropical islands of Indonesia during this same period, you would find an evolutionary experiment that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel. On the isolated island of Flores, a species known as Homo floresiensis lived for tens of thousands of years. Because of a biological phenomenon known as island dwarfism, where large animals shrink over generations to cope with limited island resources, these humans evolved to be just over 3 feet tall. They had small brains, roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, yet they walked upright, made sophisticated stone tools, hunted miniature elephants, and managed to survive on a volatile island surrounded by Komodo dragons. They were fully human, but scaled down to a completely different dimension. And they weren't the only ones. In the Philippines, researchers recently uncovered Homo luzonensis, another small-bodied relative living on an isolated island at the exact same time. If we push the clock back just a little further, say to 100,000 years ago, the landscape becomes dizzying. In Africa, the ancient small-brained Homo naledi was navigating deep subterranean cave systems. Meanwhile, the legendary Homo erectus, perhaps the most successful human species to ever live, a creature that survived for nearly 2 million years, was still clinging to life in the river valleys of Java. Imagine that world. Imagine an Earth where you could walk across a continent and encounter people who spoke different types of languages, possessed entirely different physical proportions, viewed the world through entirely different sensory structures, yet shared your fundamental capacity to think, to make, and to suffer. Our planet was a vibrant tapestry of human possibilities. It was an ecosystem of minds. And then, in a geological heartbeat, the tapestry was shredded. One by one, the lights went out. Then, one by one, the branches began to disappear. Not all at once, not in a single catastrophe. More like lights going out across a continent, a population here, a lineage there, until eventually an entire family tree had been reduced to a single surviving branch. The Neanderthals faded from the valleys of Europe. By roughly 30,000 years ago, the crowded room had been emptied. The bush had been pruned down to a single, solitary branch. Why? What happened to the others? For decades, the standard explanation was simple, comforting, and brutal. We were just better. We were smarter. Our language was superior. Our tools were sharper. And when we marched out of Africa, we simply outcompeted or directly exterminated the resident populations. It's a narrative of absolute victory that fits neatly into a certain view of human nature. But history is rarely that neat. When anthropologists and geneticists look closely at the data, the idea of a swift, triumphant conquest begins to crumble, replaced by a much more complex and mysterious reality. Take the climate. The period when these species began to disappear coincides with a time of intense, erratic climate instability. The world was plunging into the coldest depths of the last ice age. Landscapes were shifting overnight. Forests were transforming into barren, windswept steppes. For a specialized species like the Neanderthals, who relied on stealth hunting in forested environments, the sudden disappearance of the trees was a catastrophic blow. It wasn't necessarily that Homo sapiens showed up with weapons and wiped them out. It was that the environment they had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to vanished beneath their feet. Then there is the silent weapon, disease. Every time a population that has been isolated for millennia meets another group, they don't just exchange words or ideas. They exchange invisible armies of pathogens. When Homo sapiens moved into territories held by other human species, some researchers have suggested that disease may have played a role. When Homo sapiens moved into territories occupied by other human species, they may have carried pathogens the local populations had never encountered before. A simple virus that caused a mild cough in a Homo sapiens could have acted like a plague when introduced to a Neanderthal valley, devastating entire lineages before a single stone tool was ever thrown in anger. But the most profound revelation of modern genetics is that the disappearance of these species wasn't just a story of death, it was also a story of intimacy. When scientists finally mapped the entire Neanderthal genome in 2010, they decided to compare it against the DNA of living people today. If Homo sapiens had simply replaced them, there should be no connection. Instead, they found something that changed our understanding of our own identity forever. If your ancestry originates outside of sub-Saharan Africa, between 1 and 2% of your DNA is Neanderthal. If your ancestry traces back to indigenous populations in Oceania, Australia, or parts of Asia, up to 4 to 6% of your genetic code comes directly from the Denisovans. They didn't just vanish. They looked into our eyes, and we looked into theirs, and we recognized each other. We held hands, we built families, and we had children. They didn't completely die out. They were absorbed. Pieces of them are alive right now, walking through modern cities, folded inside the genetic code of billions of living people. The genes we inherited from them weren't just useless junk either. They gave us survival traits. The variant of a gene that allows modern Tibetans to breathe easily at altitudes where others suffer from oxygen deprivation was inherited directly from the Denisovans. Certain immune system genes that help us fight off Eurasian viruses were gifts from our Neanderthal ancestors. Yet even with interbreeding, the mystery remains. Why did their distinct physical forms, their unique cultures, and their independent evolutionary paths stop while ours kept going? Why did we become the main river while they became small tributaries fading into our current? Maybe it came down to a tiny, almost imperceptible difference in the way we organized our minds. While Neanderthals were incredibly smart, their archaeological sites suggest they lived in small, highly localized family units. They rarely traveled long distances to trade for materials, preferring to use whatever stone was nearby. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, developed a strange, almost pathological obsession with networks. We built massive, sprawling social structures. We traded seashells across hundreds of miles of land, connecting groups that had never seen one another. When crisis struck, when the climate collapsed or disease swept through, a small isolated group of Neanderthals had no safety net. If their local valley failed, they died. But a Homo sapiens group could lean on a vast network of distant allies. They could move, share resources, and borrow knowledge. We didn't survive because we had larger brains or stronger muscles. We survived because we knew how to connect. We were a global network before we even knew what a globe was. But we must resist the temptation to view this outcome as an inevitable triumph of progress. We look back at the evolutionary landscape and see our survival as proof that we were the chosen lineage, the pinnacle of the human story. But evolution doesn't have a destination. It doesn't care about progress. It cares about survival in a specific moment. If a few climate cycles had turned differently, if a particular pathogen had mutated in a different direction, or if our ancestors had stayed in Africa just a few millennia longer, the world today might look completely different. The cities we live in might have been designed by the wide, powerful hands of Neanderthals. The philosophy taught in universities might have emerged from the deep forest perspectives of the Denisovans. We are not the climax of the human story. We are simply the last survivors of a shipwreck. When you look at a modern globe, you are looking at a deeply unnatural map. The existence of only one human species on an entire planet is a bizarre biological anomaly. For millions of years, the human experience was defined by diversity, by plurality, by the presence of the other. What does it do to a species to grow up in total isolation? Because we have been alone for 30,000 years, we have developed a deep existential loneliness that influences everything we build. We look out at the animal kingdom and see a vast, unbridgeable gulf between us and everything else. We look at chimpanzees and dolphins and see smart creatures, but we don't see peers. We feel uniquely entitled to dominate, reshape, and exploit the planet because we convinced ourselves that we are fundamentally separate from nature. But if the Neanderthals or the Denisovans were still walking among us today, that gulf would vanish. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning in a world where you share your subway commute with another species of human. They don't look like you. Their minds work differently. Their artistic expressions feel completely foreign, yet they are undeniably human. How would we define human rights? Would we have used them as slaves, or would we have learned to share the planet with a true equal? How would religions have adapted to the knowledge that God or the universe didn't create one special image, but several? Would it have made us more cruel, or would it have taught us a deep, profound humility? We will never know the answers to those questions. The voices of our siblings have been quiet for 30,000 generations. All that remains of them are a few scattered bones resting in dark caves, some faint patterns carved into stone walls, and the silent, invisible fragments of their genetic code riding along inside our cells. We are a species with amnesia, standing on a planet that used to be a home for many kinds of people. And as we look out into the cosmos, searching the stars for signs of alien life, desperately hoping to find an intelligent signal in the dark, we are driven by that same ancient forgotten ache. We aren't just searching for something new. We are looking for the family we lost,